Hey everyone, welcome back. For those of you who are new to joining my channel, I am Shakira Hill Taylor, also known as the Doula. In the last two videos, we've been talking about what it means to be a doula, what the role of a doula is. If you are someone who is interested in looking for a doula, what are the things that you should be looking for and how you might be able to get the cost of your birth services covered. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my personal journey into birth work and why I decided to become a doula and get into birth education more specifically. So we're going to jump right in. So I decided to become a doula because growing up, I grew up in a very West Indian household. Both of my parents are from the West Indies. My mom is Cuban and Jamaican. My dad is Afro Jamaican and Indo-Jamaican. And so if you are somebody who is a child of immigrant parents or comes from a West Indian or some form of diasporic or even Latin community, then you know that immigrant parents can tend to be a little bit more conservative and a lot of conversations can be very taboo. And so I grew up in a home where we did not talk about things like sex, and especially not reproduction, other than the conversation around pregnancy, which was, you will not come in this house pregnant. My mother and I have always had a very rigid relationship, and we never really had the kind of close bond where I thought that I could go to her with any question or any type of curiosity with the safety and trust that that would get answered in a way that would lead me to deeper understanding around my own awareness of my body and my body in relation to others. And so I grew up without just context around my body, what that would mean for reproduction, my reproductive system, if I so choose to become pregnant someday. And I walked around with a lot of ignorance, which I think a lot of young people do, especially teenagers tend to use their peer groups and things like porn and pop culture to educate themselves on things like sex. And so I didn't have that context. I didn't have the relationships there with my parents to be able to have those kind of conversations. And the education system was not providing that kind of education. And I grew up before social media advanced in the way that it has, where there are YouTubers and people on platforms like Twitter and Instagram providing this kind of information. It wasn't until I turned 16, I had gotten my first period at 15, which is relatively late. The average age of menstrual cycle is about 12 to 13. I got mine at 15, and I was so scared that I didn't even tell my mom when I got my first menstrual cycle. I tried to hide it and I didn't know what to do. I used a sock in place of a pad because I didn't have any ability to get the resources and tools that I would need to navigate my menstrual cycle each month. My mother did eventually find out. She is a mother. If nothing else, she noticed that her child was more tired than normal and obviously in a lot of pain. What I didn't know is that a young woman is most fertile after her first menstrual cycle and in the first few years of her menstrual cycle because she has more eggs. And so I was in a relationship with a gentleman at the time, and the first time that I had sex became pregnant. And again, that lack of close relationship with my mom or feeling like I had any safe space to share, I did not tell anyone that I was pregnant. And I didn't know what to do. I had decided that I was going to somehow try to keep the baby. My mom did eventually find out, and there were some conversations that I share in my book about what happened and led to the pregnancy termination that I ultimately had. But even after that pregnancy termination, there was no conversation, no pivoting back on what does this mean for my sexual health going forward? What does this mean for my future if I should choose to get pregnant again? There were no follow-up conversations. And so I was again left without any guidance or structure. And then sometime after, when I regained my cycle following the pregnancy termination, I also then discovered that I had endometriosis. And I discovered that as someone who, even from a young age, learned how to be very in tune with my body and realized that my menstrual cycles were incredibly painful. And when I would talk to my peers, they weren't experiencing some of the symptoms that I was. And so I was at an age where I was working, I had a work permit, I had the ability to go to a doctor, and I started going to a gynecologist because at that point I had had sex, and even though I had stopped having sex, I was now able to see a gynecologist. And I went through a very intensive process to get an official diagnosis of my endometriosis. I remember trying to explain to gynecologists the pain that I was experiencing, that something about it didn't feel right and I wasn't being heard. I think partially because I was young, partially because I was Black. I remember being put on birth control without really having the conversation that really uncovered what was actually going on. And at the same time, I was getting a series of ovarian cysts, which can sometimes be a symptom of endometriosis. And so not having that kind of support both at home and in my personal life, and seeing the barriers there were in the medical system, I grew very sensitive to what was happening with my body, and also what would that mean for me as now someone who was coming into autonomy as I was getting older and closer to going away to college. I needed to learn more. And so I started, even at that age, doing just research on things like endometriosis, ovarian cysts, and just being very curious, but not really sure of where that would lead me. Fast forward to my very early 30s, more data started to come out about Black women in particular and postpartum mortality rates. And as a Black woman who was in her 30s, in the demographic of those most likely to experience postpartum mortality, I grew very concerned about the concept of weathering, which is a theoretical concept that says because Black women experience racism all the time, internally and mentally, we are weathering all the time. Our body is weathering, which is why Black women tend to get things like thyroids, hypertension, and other comorbidities more often than white women and other racial groups. And I was very concerned that this data wasn't getting more traction. Although it was getting the news coverage, there was not the dollars being invested in more research to understand, well, now that this is a problem, what do we do? I started to learn about doula work through my full-time work in communication, social impact communication, strategic communication specifically, where I was working on and continue to work on public health campaigns, environment sustainability campaigns, all of these big campaigns, and seeing that like there are things that even at smaller scales can be done, like getting people more access to birth workers, midwives, and doulas. I also became really frustrated with the lack of advocacy for getting education into the hands of those who were most impacted. There's so in the next few series that I'm doing and putting together, I'm going to be getting a little bit more practical into some tips for those of you who are hoping to get pregnant soon or currently pregnant and are looking to prepare for labor and delivery, I have some great educational videos coming up for you. Also, if you've been following, thank you so much for liking, for sharing my videos. If you're not already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Instagram at @the_dope_doula, and I will talk to you next time.